We need as many minds as possible working together on those problems so that we can understand what happens in Alzheimer's disease, in Parkinson's disease, in autism spectrum disorder. We need the best minds on that problem wherever they are, and to let them work together to make fast progress.
I'm John Fox, Director of the Del Monte Institute for Neuroscience at the University of Rochester, and I'd like to thank you for joining us again for another episode of Neuroscience Perspectives. Please do like and follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts or you get your videocasts. We're on the road today at the annual Society for Neuroscience Conference here in beautiful San Diego, California, and I'm absolutely delighted to be on the West Coast, where we find incredible scientists like Dr. Anne Churchland. Dr. Churchland is a professor of neurobiology at the David Geffen School of Medicine and the Brain Research Institute at the University of California, Los Angeles, UCLA. Her research explores how the brain integrates information from multiple senses, multisensory integration, to guide behavior and decision making. And she is a true innovator, demonstrating that the rodent model can be used to study higher level cognitive functions, something we'll talk about. Dr. Churchland is the recipient of the Pradl Research Award from the National Academy of Sciences, and she's also a founding member of the International Brain Laboratory, an important space in open science, which we'll get to talk about more. Dr. Churchland, I'm so pleased to have you here today on our roving Neuroscience Perspectives. I have a ton of questions for you, so maybe we can just dive into your work, and we'll get to talk about you and the motivations and how you came to science in due course. But your research is instrumental in our understanding of decision-making and how it's influenced or instantiated in neural circuitry. Tell us about what you're working on right now, and why did you choose decision-making? What's so important about it?
Yeah, well, I'll start by answering that question first. So we decided to study decision-making because ultimately we're really interested in cognition, in the circuits in the brain that make it possible for us to engage in interesting cognitive functions, sort of manipulating variables in the world and using them to strategically guide action. And there are decisions, of course, of varying complexity. Some decisions that we make as humans are very complex, but there are also really simple ones and everything in between. And so we like decision making because it's complex enough to tell us something interesting about how the brain instantiates those interesting cognitive computations, but simple enough that we can study it in animal models.
I think a lot of people out there, okay, I get it, why decision making's crucial to humans. We make these very complicated decisions, policy, you name it. How on earth is that something that we can find relevance in a small little rodent? Is a rodent, how can we square that circle?
Yeah, that's a great question. And there are definitely some big differences between rodent and human brains. And I don't want to suggest otherwise. But I think also that there are circuits for cognition that are more similar across species than many people think.
Right.
And so to give you an example of the kind of decision that we're interested in studying, I'll give you a couple of examples, and that we found to be really similar between humans and rodents. One example is decisions that combine sensory information with prior beliefs about the world. Okay, so these are decisions that humans make all the time. I live in Southern California. If I wake up and it's cloudy outside, I have a strong prior that it will be a dry day nonetheless, just because it almost never rains in Southern California. And so even if I see that sensory evidence of a cloudy sky, I probably won't bring an umbrella because my prior belief is telling me that the sensory evidence shouldn't worry me too much.
Right.
However, somebody who lives in London, for example, or even Rochester, might have a very different prior on the probability that it will rain. And they might make a very different decision, even in the face of the same sensory evidence, because the prior in other parts of the world and the country is that clouds mean rain. Right. So that's an example of a kind of decision that combines sensory evidence with a prior belief. And we can recreate that scenario in the laboratory in a fairly straightforward way by teaching animals to have prior beliefs about the world and then presenting them with sensory evidence that's sometimes reliable, sometimes unreliable, and seeing if, just like humans, they combine sensory evidence and prior beliefs to make a good decision.
Fantastic. I can tell you, though, if you grew up in Dublin, even if it was a perfectly blue sky, you'd still bring the umbrella. Forget the prior.
Totally different prior, yeah.
Exactly.
I might be in trouble in Dublin, actually.
Yes, exactly. Well, that's fantastic. And I suppose, too, people would be a little bit surprised at just the complexity of the kinds of decisions that a rodent can make. It's not, not just, this food or that food. They can really do quite sequenced behaviors and quite complex behaviors.
That's right. And when I first started my lab, we were focused very intently on multisensory integration and the idea that humans and possibly rodents and rats as well might combine visual and auditory information. And that's something that as humans, of course, we do all the time, right? We all know that it's easier to understand someone if you can both see and hear them than if you only have one of those sensory modalities. Like if you're talking on the phone without video, it can be difficult to understand someone when there's a poor connection because you don't have that visual information.
Right.
So we certainly had some sense that probably animals use visual and auditory information. I mean, they have eyes and ears, so that was pretty expected. But what was really surprising is that they combine that sensory information in a very strategic way, where they weight each sensory modality by how reliable it is.
Right.
So they don't sort of slap together auditory and visual information willy-nilly. They do it in a way that really reflects how reliable each evidence source is. And they do that without training, actually, in a way that's very similar to humans.
Right.
So it surprised a lot of people that the rodents and humans were so similar in that regard, but they really are.
Like a Bayesian framework, a
Yes.
maximum likelihood kind of model. Yeah,
That's exactly it. Yep.
Very cool. Which is really quite a sophisticated thing that's instantiated in their little brains.
It is, because you have to figure out at each moment what is the quality of the sensory evidence, right? And the quality would be like, if I'm talking on the phone, is it a good signal or is it kind of a noisy signal? Maybe there's a lot of background noise. They have to figure out the quality of the evidence of each sensory stream and then use that quality to weight those signals and then put them together and ultimately use that combined signal to guide action. So yeah, it's pretty complex behavior, but they're pretty good at it.
It brings up an interesting point, and maybe we're ranging a little bit, but there's a long tradition in the neurosciences to isolate a sensory system. We have vision societies, or the auditory societies, and so on, and people work within one sensory system, but the system itself is not unisensory in any meaningful way. It's an extraordinarily rare occasion where you'd have to be in some sort of a sensory deprivation or a laboratory to where only vision is coming at you. Is that something actually folks should be concerned about? Should we always be studying in this kind of more multisensory dynamical space?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. In the real world, it happens very rarely that we encounter a stimulus that only activates a single sensory modality, like only vision or only auditory. And in the real world, most stimuli are just naturally multisensory, right? Even if you pick up an apple, you can see it, you can see its color, that tells you about the ripeness. You can also smell it, you can also feel it. The world is multisensory.
Right.
And I think that means in experiments where we want to recreate the way that a subject is interacting with the world, then we do want to give them that multisensory experience. That doesn't mean all experiments should be done that way, though. I think there can also be value in looking at the impact of a single sensory modality in isolation. It's sort of a trade-off between a naturalistic environment versus having complete experimental control.
Exactly.
And I think for each project, kind of for each scientific question, you want it to be as natural as possible, but you also need a certain amount of control. So you have to kind of weigh those in a very thoughtful way.
Right. So we mentioned in our opening about the International Brain Lab, and you're a founding member, and I know this is something that's near and dear to your heart. Tell us about the International Brain Lab, your thoughts about open science, and I think you were mentioning to me, about recent work on reproducibility and how crucial all that is for the scientific enterprise now.
Yeah, absolutely. So when a crew of us came together to form the International Brain Laboratory, our thinking was as follows. We really want to understand how neurons all across the brain participate in decision-making behaviors, but we can't, no single one of us had the capability to measure neural activity in every brain area because that's just beyond the scope of what a single lab can accomplish. And so we decided to kind of divvy up that task among our 10 experimental labs and then to partner really closely with our 10 or 11, depends how you count, theoretical labs to help us interpret the neural data and use it to make new models of decision making. We were committed right from the beginning to sharing all of our data, all of our tools with the world publicly. And that's something that we have done that I'm really proud of. The International Brain Laboratory has now completed the goal both of making that brain-wide map and also sharing all the tools.
That's fantastic, yeah.
And an interesting thing happened along the way with respect to reproducibility. So of course we all cared about reproducibility before. I mean, who doesn't care about reproducibility? But the ability of any single lab to tackle the problem is rather limited, right? Because you might read a paper that got a different result from what your lab got, but you don't really know why, right? Was it just noise, or they did something differently? And we really had an opportunity to tackle this problem head on because we were collecting data in a distributed fashion in 10 different experimental labs. So we could look at the data from each lab, look at which features of the data reproduced and which ones did not reproduce, understanding which aspects of the data were vulnerable to potentially a lack of reproducibility, and what could we learn from that in a way that was relevant to others in the field that were collecting similar kinds of data.
Yeah. So were you sharing paradigms then across the 10 labs? Was that like folks would work, I see, so that you'd see if it replicates in different settings, different...
Yeah, so we aim to standardize everything.
Yeah,
so in principle, there should be no issues about reproducibility at all because everything was completely standardized across labs.
Yeah. Very much like our own lab is involved in the adolescent brain cognitive development study, which is in 21 sites, and you can really look at those. If there's anything peculiar going on in one of the sites, or how well things replicate, and it's a very powerful methodology. How did you choose those 10 labs, and where are they?
Oh, they're distributed in 3 different countries. So they are in the United States, in England, in Portugal, and Switzerland. I guess, did I say 3?
That's 4.
And within those countries, within the U.S., there are multiple different universities at the U.S.
Which is another real strength of this. So it's a global effort.
It's
and
a global
it really gets
effort.
after, that's fantastic. Really superb model for doing science, big science really, and important science that's not just locked in at one individual and one interest.
Absolutely. And I think as scientists, we have an opportunity to collaborate in a way that spans international borders that is unique and I think can make a massive contribution. We all want to understand the brain because we ultimately want to improve human health. And whether somebody's tackling that problem in the United States or in Ireland or in Asia, if they're collecting data that's relevant to that enterprise, I want to know it and I want to work with that person. And so the international aspect, I thought, was personally very gratifying.
And tell us then, so now you have these 10 sites. And you were mentioning, theoreticians inputting. Are they at the same sites, or
no? They were also geographically dispersed.
So this is an even bigger network.
Yeah. So there were around 20 labs total, and they were all at different universities.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's really a mind meld. You're really bringing together a generative engine of thinkers and doers, experimentalists and theoreticians.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
How interesting. And well, not to get controversial about it, but given current political zeitgeist, there's a little bit of a closing down and a winnowing or building walls, particularly between nations right now. How much are you worried about that, and how has it impacted the Brain Lab?
Oh, I am very worried about it, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. And I think, for someone at an American university, the community of international students that we have at our university at UCLA, but at many other universities in the United States as well, they're just a critical part of our community. And the fact that people want to come from other countries to learn with us in the U.S. has just been critical for the scientific enterprise, also for many cultural goals and other things as well. And so the idea that might shut down, that we can't cross international borders when we need to for science, is it's absolutely devastating. And we need a world where people can share ideas and share data and share techniques across international borders, because ultimately we all share the same goal.
Right. Especially when really the point is the relief of human suffering and improvement of health outcomes and so on, and why that would be sort of stuck in one nation or needs to be a secret is kind of crazy, right? Because in the end of the day, the health of the world is crucial.
Exactly, and we need as many minds as possible working together on those problems so that we can understand what happens in Alzheimer's disease, in Parkinson's disease, in autism spectrum disorder. We need the best minds on that problem wherever they are, and to let them work together to make fast progress.
Yeah, and I mean, just to double down on that, this is the hub of great science in this country, right? And that's why people have come from every corner of the globe to train here. Many stay here, and that's what's one of the enriching parts of the American science juggernaut, the whole enterprise. And it'd be a shame to lose that right now.
Very, very much so. Yeah.
Do you worry? So. And what about, just not to stick too much into policy, But there's certainly things around, for example, I know you have a podcast as well where you talk about things like, sex as a biological variable, and that's been, somehow that became unpopular. Do you want to weigh in a bit on that here for our viewers and explain what you see going on right now in the policy space?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was really surprising to see our current administration object to, for example, including things like sex as a biological variable in different kinds of studies. And the reason is because sex is something that has implications for the brain, right? In ways that and studying this will benefit both men and women. Like, here's an example. So men and women age quite differently. And for many kinds of neurodegeneration and cognitive decline, and also just lifespan, women appear to be protected. It would be crazy to study aging without looking at the sex of the subjects that you're studying, whether they're mice or humans. It doesn't matter. This difference occurs across all different animals. It has to be taken account in order to make sense of the data. And this will certainly, potentially benefit women, but it could benefit men too, right? Like there are factors that are protective in the female brain that could be used as a therapeutic in the male brain once we understand what those are. Right now, we don't understand what those are. And the idea that we would just ignore them and pretend that doesn't matter in the study of aging will make us miss, I think, very important scientific discoveries that could benefit everyone.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, autism spectrum disorder, much more prevalent in males. When it's in females, much more severe, very, very clear sex differences.
And ADHD as well.
ADHD. There are many of the rare neurodevelopmental diseases like Rett syndrome that are very specific to females. And many of those things are recapitulated in the mouse models that we have in the murine models. So you see those fundamental sex differences. If you roll it all together, you lose understanding.
That's right. Yeah. That's right. So you're averaging across something that shouldn't be averaged across.
Yeah, and you may not learn about either then.
Yes. True.
Because you're mixing apples and oranges in some cases.
Yeah.
Well, that's really fantastic. I love the idea of the International Brain Lab, and I think we're looking at a lot more of those big networks now across the globe and even nationally, where the data are not being hoarded in the investigators' lab; they're being released to the scientific public. And just from a pure economics perspective, in terms of a taxpayer's bang for the buck, that makes a lot of sense, right? The data go much further.
Absolutely. And I feel like this is something I actually learned during my postdoctoral training, that it should be just part of the workflow, that at the end of the project, you make the data publicly available. Yeah. And this means that each individual piece of data, which much of it truly belongs to the taxpayers, right? Because it's been funded by the National Institute of Health, it makes that data go further. The data that I published in my postdoc has been repurposed by many other groups and has led to many other papers, a number of which I'm not even a part of. I just gave them the data and they ran the study that they ran. And that doesn't mean that that's always easy or even possible in all cases. Some data is human data. It can't just be shared freely with the public. Yeah. But in the case of neural activity data from mice, that is something where there are not privacy concerns, and it can and should be shared. And I think it's really just kind of a cultural thing. I think if, for me, I kind of came of age always thinking, we will always do this. It's just part of what you do. Right. But for people who are new to it, I think, there's a lot of hesitation. They also just sometimes aren't really set up for the data to be in a shareable format because they weren't planning to share it all along. But I think the culture has changed a lot. People share data a lot more. Well,
and some of the data sharing too, it's a little bit of an unfunded mandate, right? And if you're a relatively small lab and you're collecting the data, and then you have to put it into a specialized format and get it on a repository, and there's real labor and it's involved in that. And that can be a little difficult.
There is, but it's a lot easier than it used to be. So, for example, there are now great automated tools where you can put your data in an automated way into neurodata without borders format. It's called NWB. It's a standardized data format. And then you can store it for free on something called the Dandy Archive. And that will take a little bit of time, but it's quite different from having to package all of your data yourself, thinking about the fields and the metadata and storing, putting it on your own server that you're paying for. I think we do live in a world where it is possible to do that. And I hope my colleagues will follow suit.
And maybe our regulatory bodies and the funders would also get on board with actually funding that piece of it as well to more effect, to greater effect.
Yeah, it would help if there was more funding to have more options of where people could place their data. I think there are some good options, like Dandy Archive is one of them, but there might be certain data types that are not suited to that, and it isn't always obvious to people where they should put them.
Very good, very good. Now, you were talking before about theoreticians and experimentalists. And so can we dive into Anne Churchland and where she came from? Because, obviously you have had some major influences from a theoretical perspective. Both your mom and dad are really world-renowned philosophers, neurophilosophers, and that. Tell us what it was like growing up in a household with two parents who were so prominent in the academy. And I can't even imagine what the conversations around the table were, but they were probably very different than the ones I grew up with.
Well, yeah, I think actually we did really have great conversations around the dinner table, right from when I was a very little kid.
Yeah.
We're all from Canada originally, and my parents originally had their positions at the University of Manitoba in central Canada. And it was sort of an isolating experience because they were from a different part of Canada. They were very far from their families. There weren't too many folks around that were kind of interested in the same things. But I think they kind of took that as an opportunity to really take a traditional philosophy of mind approach and bring it in a totally new direction where they wanted to think about how what we're learning about the brain would impact these philosophical questions about what is the nature of the mind.
Right.
And at the time this was, or even now, this is actually hugely controversial, right? And many philosophers say, well, we don't need to know about the brain. That's the hardware. We're interested in the software.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a very popular point of view, but they were really enthusiastic about the brain right from the time I was a little kid.
Yeah.
And I think both their kind of specific interest in the brain and also more generally their kind of curiosity about the world and in understanding the world and how things work, I think was very, very inspiring for me as a kid.
And your brother Mark as well, who I know well, is a neuroscientist as well. It's running through the family.
I think, maybe there's a gene for it. We'll
there
learn
might
one
be.
day.
You never know. Is there pressure in life over the years having such prominent parents in the field, or is it just fine?
Oh, well, I think, I don't know if there was pressure exactly. I certainly didn't feel pressured to go into the field at all. And also my parents, they're not neuroscientists, they're philosophers.
Right.
They didn't run experiments and things like that, so it was a bit different. Certainly did not feel any pressure. I think there was one thing that I benefited from that was really helpful, which was seeing them, and I think my mom especially, face some very, very critical feedback for her work and just keep on going.
Right.
And I both saw her do that and hear people say incredibly, things that were not just critical, but deeply unfair.
Yeah.
And she would just keep going. And I really, that was really
was misogyny
inspiring.
a part of that, do you think, as
Oh,
well?
definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. I mean, I think in philosophy, it's a very male-dominated field. And it's also kind of one of those fields where the genius myth really persists, right? And those fields tend to, I think, be really tough for women. But she persisted, and I think, I remember being a grad student and on a couple of occasions, people saying really, really negative things about my parents, not knowing we were related, and just kind of learning from that and thinking okay, this is something people do in the field. They can be very critical, and that's fine. Everyone's got an opinion, and you just pick up and move on. So I think that helped me to kind of learn to have a thick
inbuilt
skin.
resilience.
In the face of folks who disagree, and to be able to kind of pick up and keep going even when people are very negative.
And did your mom and dad meet because of philosophy in the academy?
They did. They met at the University of British Columbia, where they were both undergraduates, and they met in a first-year philosophy class.
Wonderful.
And,
And is there a long lineage then of academia?
No,
so
not
they're the
at
first
all.
ones,
No,
right?
actually, my mom came from a farm that is in the interior part of British Columbia, so not on the coast, but interior from that. And she was on a fruit farm and had to work at the packing house in order to afford the tuition at UBC. And my dad came from a family where his dad was a teacher in Vancouver, and his mom was at home. Also later became a teacher. His dad was a shop teacher, so I think taught him and his brother a lot about building things with tools and making things. And I think that was very influential, but it was not an academic setting at all.
Let me bring you back to something you said there. And I think it's one of those things that gets said a lot, where the brain is the hardware, the cells are the hardware, and the thinking and all the other stuff, the computations are software. Is that a reasonable way to think about brain organization?
No, I don't think so. I think it's kind of wishful thinking on the part of people that don't kind of want to learn anatomy and physiology, that they can understand how the brain works by ignoring all of these physical constraints.
That's right,
and
yeah.
imagining that we can understand the mind and the brain entirely just by kind of sitting around and thinking about it. And I think we can't. I think the physical being of the brain ultimately constrains how it works. Where are the neurons located? Which other neurons can they talk to?
Right.
How long does that communication take? What cell type are they? All of these things constrain, they impose major constraints on how the system works. So I think we can't separate the hardware from the software.
The wiring is the computation.
Yeah.
It's not there's no duality there. You don't just load up the system.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. You have to know what the pieces are in order to make sense of it.
And if you weren't a neuroscientist today, and you could pull that other job out of the bag, out of the hat, what would it be?
Oh, I don't know. I'm interested in so many things. You know, when I was a kid, I had no interest in being a scientist. I always wanted to be a teacher.
Yeah.
And I think one of many careers that I think would be really interesting is I think it would be great to be a math teacher.
Yeah.
I think when I think of
And
the people.
your undergrad was in mathematics,
it was,
right?
actually, yeah. And when I think about the people that taught me math when I was in middle school and high school, I think those teachers, many of whom were women actually, they have a lasting impact on their students, and they have the opportunity to give their students, I think, skills that they will carry with them throughout their life. And I also feel like that fairly simple math that you learn in middle school and high school, I think it's beautiful and really fun. And I really enjoyed kind of working through it with my own kids, actually. There's sort of a running joke in my house that like one of the kids will be struggling with the math, and they'll be like, "No, I don't want any help."
Right.
Because I'm like, "Can I help? Can I help?"
I love it. Well, that leads in actually really nicely into a question about mentorship, because we always like to ask folks about that. You know, we've already talked about how these are difficult times. Students aren't coming. Graduate schools aren't accepting schools this year. Some of the big schools aren't even opening the doors. So it's going to be a really difficult year, and maybe quite some number of difficult years for youngsters coming into this field.
Yeah.
What do you tell your current trainees, and what would you tell a kid out there right now who's applying to grad school, where the chances are probably 50% of what they were last year to get in someplace? Like, what do you say to folks out there now in the current situation?
Yeah, well, I think two things. I think first of all, I really hope that people will be persistent and join our field anyway. And I've been just so devastated to see a loss of opportunity for young scientists at the earliest stage of our career. So I really hope that people are willing to be persistent and keep trying and keep applying, even though the chances are a little bit lower this year. The other thing I would say, and I would tell incoming graduate students this even before we enter these difficult times, which is that especially when you're a graduate student, the quality of the mentorship is actually the most important thing. And I think people forget this. They often start graduate school because they've had a really exciting professor as an undergrad talking about, whatever, the amygdala, okay? Right. And this professor really, convinced them that the amygdala was the most important thing. And the amygdala is awesome. Like, it really is, no question about it. But this sometimes leads people to forget that there are many, many interesting problems in the field. And so if folks come to a graduate program and the person who worked on the amygdala isn't taking students, that is a disappointment. Yeah. But keep an open mind, because there might be a totally fantastic scientific problem that you never even considered that will totally blow your mind. And I think we tend to forget that there kind of is a shortage of great mentors in the field, but there's no shortage of really interesting scientific problems, so many interesting problems. So if you find someone who's a really committed mentor as a student that cares about your trajectory, wants to help you overcome obstacles, wants to work with you to get through those difficult times, go work with that person. And I bet you'll find out that what they're working on, it could be really exciting in a way that you might not appreciate right from the get-go.
So very good advice to mentees. What about it? Do you have a top thing that you would say to other mentors? In terms of like your experiences of dealing with graduate students and seeing them through those phases of life and launching them out into a career, is there any magic formula there? Is there a recipe?
Yeah, I think one shortcoming that a lot of mentors have is that when they are interacting with the student and things aren't going well, like the mentor's kind of getting frustrated, like for example, maybe the student gives a presentation and the presentation is nowhere near where it needs to be in order for them to give a talk at the Society for Neuroscience meeting, for example. And I think sometimes the mentors have trouble figuring out specifically what's wrong with the presentation, and so they just get really emotional. And so they use emotional language like, well, that was terrible. Well, that's not intelligent.
Yeah.
And you know, we're all humans, we have emotional reactions, but that kind of feedback is not specific. And when things aren't going well, the most important thing I think to do as a mentor is to step back and take a little thought, but figure out specifically what is holding that person back, whether it's in terms of their presentation or in terms of their scientific project, like specifically what's happening and what can you tell that person so that they can, change their approach and get to a better place.
Maybe not understanding too sometimes just how hard that hits a youngster because I don't think mentors always realize how much of a hero they are. You've got this amazing, career and work, and so these youngsters are looking to you and they see you really on a pedestal. So when you start hitting them with some emotional language, it hits home.
It hits home really hard, and it's impossible to get better if you're just told you're bad, right? Like you need something specific, like this, you've left yourself vulnerable to this. This conclusion is vulnerable to this criticism. This data is uninterpretable because the sample size is too small. This could be an interesting result, but the way that you visualize the data, we can't interpret it. Right. So it has to be really specific so that the person can actually have a hope of improving. Very
good, very good. Now, just maybe going a little bit further in this, you are the originator of Anne's List. Tell us about Anne's List.
Yeah. Well, so this is a website that I started many years ago that lists women that are in computational and systems neuroscience. And the reason I started making the list, it originally was just a Google sheet. And I used to be involved with the computational and systems neuroscience, the COSIGN planning committee. And at that time, when I first became involved with the meeting, there were very few female speakers. And I really wanted to fix this problem. And so sometimes over the course of the year, I would hear a woman give a talk, and I would think, oh, she would be such a perfect fit for the COSIGN meeting. I got to remember her and write her down so that we can, consider her among the list of invited speakers later in the year. So I started just jotting down people's names. And then a few people, I think it was my colleague, Adrian Fairhall, who was also really committed to this issue, would be like, oh yeah, can I just see that list you made? And can I add a few people? So it kind of really grew organically. It stayed as a Google Sheet for a long time, and then eventually I moved it to a slightly nicer software. It's hosted on WordPress. And then it kind of took on a life of its own, and a lot of people found it useful. I also realized that sometimes women in my own field were kind of invisible to me when they shouldn't have. There are people whose work I should have known about but didn't, and learned about it through the list. And people comment to me all the time that they still use it.
Yeah. I went to a conference. I won't name and shame anybody. A few years ago, I was invited to, quite a few years ago, maybe a decade ago, I was invited to give a talk at a conference. And I started looking down to the list, and everybody was fantastic, like really fantastic. But there were 18 speakers, and every single one of them was a man.
Yeah.
And the two organizers were women scientists.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
And I wrote and I said, do you guys realize there are only 18 males on here? And it was a surprise to them. They had not entered their own. I don't think this would happen today in 2025.
Oh, okay. This was not a recent occurrence.
No, it's about a decade ago. Yeah. And I pointed out, I said, I can't come and speak at a conference where the entire panel slate is male. It makes no sense in the modern era with so many talented people out there. So.
Yeah, and when I used to see conferences like that, people's response would always be, "Oh, well, there are no women in our field."
That's what I mean,
and that's why why I made the list.
So that was when I first learned about Anne's list, because I got the exact same answer back as well. We got the best people in the field who are. And I said, how about you check out some other names? But anyway, so
well, thank you for
doing that. It was doing very well. Anne Churchland, such a pleasure to have you on Neuroscience Perspectives. Really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us and coming to join us here in the middle of a very busy Neuroscience Conference where I'm sure you've many other engagements to be going on with. So thanks so much again.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.